She traveled 1,847 miles to marry a stranger. He looked at her once and laughed. Evelyn Harper stepped off that train with a worn suitcase, a pressed dress, and every last dollar she owned sewn into the hem of her coat. She had given up everything for a man she had never met, and in front of the entire town of Black Hollow, Colorado, he looked her up and down like she was livestock at auction, and told her she wasn't worth the price of a telegram. That was supposed to be the end of her story. It wasn't. If you want to know how a woman with nothing became the most respected name in the Colorado Territory, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Black Hollow, Colorado, September 1883. The train was 40 minutes late, which gave Evelyn Harper just enough time to convince herself she was making a terrible mistake. She sat rigid on the wooden bench inside the last car, her hands folded in her lap, watching the landscape outside shift from the flat brown grasslands of Kansas into something rougher and more unforgiving. The mountains appeared first as dark suggestions on the horizon, then grew larger and more real with every passing mile, their peaks already dusted with early snow even in September. They were nothing like the gentle hills she had grown up with in Ohio. These mountains looked like they could swallow a person whole and not notice. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cold glass and exhaled. "You've made your choice," she told herself. "No use being afraid of it now." The choice had been made 6 weeks earlier in the back kitchen of a boarding house in Columbus, where she worked 14-hour days washing dishes and sleeping in a room barely large enough to turn around in. The other women at the boarding house had shown her the advertisement in the Regional Gazette. Prosperous Colorado rancher seeks capable, respectable woman for companionship and marriage. Willing to relocate. Room, board, and security provided. Serious inquiries only. There had been a name, Harrison Aldridge, and a post office address in Black Hollow, Colorado. "Don't do it," her friend Martha had warned, leaning against the kitchen door frame with her arms crossed. "You don't know anything about this man." "I don't know anything about any man," Evelyn had replied. "At least this one has land." Martha hadn't laughed, which was unusual for her. "Evelyn, women disappear answering advertisements like that. Women disappear staying put too." She'd folded the Gazette carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket. "I'm 31 years old, Martha. I've been washing other people's dishes since I was 16. If I don't take a chance on something now, when do I?" She had written the letter that same night, sitting at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, a single candle burning beside her. She had chosen her words carefully, honest about her age, honest about her lack of wealth, but careful to mention that she could cook, could manage a household, could read and write well, and do basic arithmetic. She was not, she had written, looking for romance. She was looking for a life. Harrison Aldridge had written back within 2 weeks. His letter was formal, even a little stiff, but it was polite. He described his ranch, over 400 acres east of Black Hollow, good grazing land, a solid house, hired men. He mentioned that he was a widower, that he had certain expectations of a wife, and that he would pay for her train ticket if she agreed to make the journey. He included a small photograph, a man in his late 40s, thick through the shoulders, dark coat, standing in front of what appeared to be a large house. He did not smile in the photograph. But then, most people didn't. She had written back the same day she received it. Yes, that had been 6 weeks ago. Now the train was pulling into Black Hollow Station, and Evelyn Harper had not slept in 2 days. Her best dress was creased beyond repair from 3 days of travel, and her mouth tasted like iron and coal smoke. She gathered her one piece of luggage, a brown leather suitcase, cracked at the corners, held together partly by a leather strap she'd borrowed from an old work harness, and stood up on legs that had gone stiff from sitting so long. The woman across the aisle, who had boarded in Denver with 2 small children and hadn't spoken a word the entire journey, glanced at her and then away. Even she seemed to sense that whatever was about to happen to Evelyn Harper at this station was not her business to witness. Evelyn straightened her back, smoothed her skirt with both hands, picked up the suitcase. "Capable," she reminded herself. "Respectable. You said so in the letter and you meant it." She stepped off the train. Black Hollow Station was small but busy. A platform of rough-cut timber ran along the track, and perhaps 40 or 50 people had gathered there, some waiting for passengers, some collecting freight, some simply standing around with the particular idle curiosity of people in small towns who treated the afternoon train as entertainment. There were men in working clothes, women in bonnets, a group of older men near the station house playing cards on an upturned crate, and 3 dogs milling through everyone's legs looking for dropped food. Evelyn stepped down onto the platform and looked around. He wasn't hard to find. Harrison Aldridge was standing near the center of the platform in a dark coat and tall boots, hat pushed back on his head, watching the train with the impatient expression of a man used to having people come to him. He was larger than the photograph suggested, broad and heavy through the middle, with a thick gray-streaked beard and small eyes that moved across the disembarking passengers with the same practical assessment he probably gave livestock. His eyes found her. She saw the moment they did. Something crossed his face. She would spend years afterward trying to name exactly what it was. Disappointment wasn't quite right. Contempt was closer. It was the look of a man whose order had arrived wrong and who was already calculating how much trouble it would be to send it back. She crossed the platform toward him anyway. Because what else was she going to do? Mr. Aldridge. She stopped a few feet away and gave a small nod. I'm Evelyn Harper. I believe you've been expecting me. He looked her over the way she had seen men look at horses they had no intention of buying. Slow, deliberate, thorough. Starting at her shoes to practical, worn, not fashionable, traveling up the length of her travel-worn dress to her face, which she knew was pale and tired and not at its best after 3 days on a train. He did not offer his hand. You're older than you said, he announced. The words were loud enough that the nearest cluster of people on the platform turned to look. Heat flooded her face. I told you exactly my age in both letters, Mr. Aldridge. 31, he said, like it was a disease. I assumed you meant you looked younger. She blinked. I'm not sure how a number can look like anything. And that dress? He shook his head. Lord, I wrote respectable, didn't I? I've been on a train for 3 days. My wife, my first wife, he said, with the emphasis of a man who had recently upgraded, would have pressed her dress the night before. She would have arrived looking like something worth the price of a ticket. He looked past her toward the departing train as though considering whether to put her back on it. I expected better. There were people watching now, not just the nearest cluster. A wider circle had formed with the slow, inevitable drift of small-town attention, finding something interesting. She could feel them, could feel the quality of their attention. Not sympathetic, not hostile, just avid. This was entertainment. Her voice, when she found it, was quieter than she intended. Mr. Aldridge, I have traveled nearly 2,000 miles to be here. I would appreciate a disappointment, he said flatly, cutting her off. He said it the way you'd announce the weather. That's the only word for it. I paid for a woman to come out here, and you are not what I paid for. He reached into his coat and produced the small envelope she recognized as the return address she had used. Her 2 letters to him, folded together. He held them out not to her but sort of into the air between them. I've changed my mind. You can take those back. She stared at the letters. I don't have a return ticket, she said quietly. That's not my problem. You paid for my ticket here. You said in your letter, I said a lot of things based on the assumption that you would be worth the investment. He dropped the letters onto the platform between their feet. I suggest you find somewhere else to be, Miss Harper. I've already wasted enough of my afternoon. He turned and walked away. Just like that. Like she was a delivery he'd refused at the door. For a moment she couldn't move. The platform seemed to tilt slightly under her feet. She was aware of the crowd, the stillness of it, the held breath of it. And then, worse, the slow resumption of noise as people decided they had seen enough and went back to their business. Conversations restarting, the dogs returning to their search for scraps. The world moving on as though nothing of consequence had just happened. She bent down and picked up the 2 letters. They were her own handwriting, her own careful, honest words. I am looking for a life. She folded them and put them in her coat pocket. Her legs carried her, she wasn't sure by whose instruction, to the far end of the platform, where a long bench sat against the station house wall under a narrow overhang. She sat down, put the suitcase between her feet, looked out at the town spread beyond the station. A main street of maybe a dozen storefronts, hitching posts, a church at one end, a saloon at the other, and beyond all of it, mountains so enormous they made every human thing beneath them look provisional. The last train west, she knew, had already come and gone. There would not be another until morning. She had $6 and some coins in her coat pocket. Money she had saved over 3 months by skipping meals twice a week. She did not know the price of a room in this town. She did not know a single person within 2,000 miles. She sat very still and did not cry, because crying would not help anything. She was still sitting there 40 minutes later when she heard footsteps stop in front of her. She looked up, already bracing for something. Another rejection, some offer she would have to refuse, someone telling her she couldn't sit here. What she saw instead was a man standing a careful distance away with 2 small girls positioned slightly behind him, half hidden, their faces peering around either side of him with the wide, cautious eyes of children who had learned not to trust strange situations. The man was tall, not imposing like Aldridge, but solid in a quiet way, like someone who did hard physical work and didn't think much about it. His coat was clean but old. His hat had been through weather. He had a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a few days and dark eyes that were looking at her not with pity, exactly, but with the careful attention of someone trying to figure out a problem, honestly. "Ma'am," he said. He had a low voice, unhurried. "I saw what happened over there." "Most people did," she said. He nodded once, acknowledging that without apology. "Harrison Aldridge is a bully with money," he said. "The combination tends to make people in this town quiet." He paused. "I'm Cole Bennett. This is Rose." One of the girls shifted half an inch forward. "And this is Clara." The other one didn't move at all. "They're twins, 7 years old." Evelyn looked at the girls. They were identical in their features, but not in their expressions. Rose had a watchful, almost serious quality, while Clara looked like she was deciding whether to bolt at any moment. Both were wearing dresses that had been mended more than once, and boots that were just slightly too big for their feet. "Hello," Evelyn said. Neither girl answered. "We came to town for supplies," Cole said. He seemed to be choosing his words the way you'd choose footing on unfamiliar ground, careful, but not hesitant. "I heard you tell Aldridge you don't have a return ticket." "That's right. I heard him say he wasn't going to do anything about it." "Also right." Cole took off his hat, held it in both hands. It was a gesture she would come to recognize as the thing he did when he was about to say something that mattered to him. "I'm not going to pretend I've got much to offer. The ranch is struggling. The house needs work. The girls—" He glanced back at them. "The girls have had a hard couple of years, and I'm not entirely sure what they need because I'm not entirely sure what I'm doing most days." He looked back at her. "But I've got a spare room that's clean and dry, and I've got a stove and enough food to feed an extra person. If you need somewhere to be while you figure out what's next, you're welcome to come out to the ranch." Evelyn stared at him. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "I know you stood up straight the whole time that man embarrassed you in front of half the town," Cole said. "That's something." He paused. "I also know you haven't moved from this bench in 40 minutes, and it gets cold fast out here once the sun goes down." She looked at the mountains. The sun was already dropping behind the western peaks, pulling the light with it. He was right about the cold. She could feel it starting at the edges, working its way through the fabric of her coat. She looked back at the girls. Claire had finally stopped considering bolting and was now studying Evelyn with the frank, unnerving focus of a child who has learned to assess adults for reliability. Rose was watching her father with an expression Evelyn couldn't quite read. "I'm not looking for charity," Evelyn said. "I'm not offering it. The cook I hired 3 months ago quit without notice, and I've been burning every third meal since." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile. "If you can cook, you'd be earning your keep." It wasn't a romantic offer. It wasn't any kind of offer she had imagined receiving when she stepped off that train. But there was something in the directness of it, no pretense, no performance, that made it feel more honest than anything Harrison Aldridge had written in 2 carefully composed letters. "I can cook," she said. "Good." He put his hat back on. "Wagons out front." The drive to the Bennett Ranch took just under 2 hours on a road that had apparently decided in some places to become a dry creek bed and in others to disappear entirely. Evelyn sat in the front of the wagon beside Cole, who who drove with the practiced ease of someone who had made this trip hundreds of times, and who spoke only occasionally and without apparent need for her to fill the silence in between. The girls sat in the wagon bed behind them. At one point, Evelyn turned around and found Rose watching her again with those serious eyes. "Do you really know how to cook?" Rose asked. "I do," Evelyn said. "Our father made soup last week," Rose said. "It tasted like boots." Cole made a sound in his throat that might have been embarrassment. "It did not taste like boots," he said. "Papa," Clara said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was smaller than her sister's, more careful. "It tasted a little like boots." Evelyn pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. "What kind of soup was it supposed to be?" "Vegetable," Cole said flatly. "Don't ask me what went wrong." "The vegetables," Rose offered helpfully. The smile won. Evelyn turned back forward before he could see it, but she caught the slight relaxation around his eyes in the dim evening light, and she thought that maybe she hadn't been entirely wrong to get in this wagon. The Bennett ranch house appeared out of the darkness as they crested a low hill, and Evelyn's first impression was of something that had been built with real care and had since been doing its best to hold together without enough of it. The main structure was solid timber and stone, 2 stories, with a covered porch that ran most of the length of the front. But the porch railing had a section missing, the paint on the shutters had weathered to almost nothing, and one of the front windows had been repaired with a piece of board where glass had apparently been at some point. The barn off to the left was in better shape than the house, a man who prioritized his animals over his own comfort. Cole pulled the wagon around to the side and stopped near a door she assumed led to the kitchen. He climbed down first, then turned automatically to help the girls, who had already jumped on their own. He looked at Evelyn with a question in his expression. She climbed down without assistance. Old habit. He didn't comment on it, just nodded and opened the kitchen door. The inside of the house was cleaner than she expected, though it had the particular quality of a space maintained by someone who knew how to prevent squalor but wasn't sure how to make anything feel inhabited. The kitchen table had been recently wiped. The floor was swept. But there were no curtains on the windows, no cloth on the table, and the single shelf above the stove held 3 mismatched tins and a cracked ceramic jar. The girls appeared in the kitchen doorway, watching her assess the room. "It's not much," Rose said, with the particular honesty of a child who has learned not to pretend. "It's a roof," Evelyn said. "That's more than I had an hour ago." She set her suitcase by the wall, took off her coat, and asked Cole where he kept the flour. She made corn cakes that first night because they were fast and she could do them in the dark with one hand. She fried them in the pan she found hanging by the stove and made a thick gravy from the heel of salt pork she found in the cold box. And she scrambled the last 4 eggs and put everything on the table in under 30 minutes. Cole sat down across from her and looked at the food like he wasn't sure it was real. The girls were already eating. "This is good," Clara said, with a kind of stunned sincerity that was somehow more affecting than enthusiasm. "It's very good," Rose confirmed, as though issuing an official judgment. Cole glanced up from his plate and met Evelyn's eyes. "Thank you," he said. It was a plain, simple thing to say, but he said it like he meant it, which in her experience was rarer than it should be. She nodded and looked back at her own plate. Outside, the wind was picking up against the mountains, and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and the 2 little girls were eating everything she'd put in front of them with the focused devotion of children who had probably gone too many nights without a decent meal. Evelyn Harper sat at a stranger's table in the middle of the Colorado wilderness, 1,000 miles from anywhere she had ever known, with $6 in her coat pocket and no plan beyond tomorrow. She told herself she would stay 3 days. That was a lie, but she didn't know it yet. She stayed in the spare room at the end of the upstairs hall, which turned out to be exactly as clean and dry as Cole had promised, and not much else. A rope bed with a wool blanket, a washstand with a cracked basin, a window that looked out over the dark shapes of the mountains. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling around her. She was not a person given to self-pity as a general rule. It seemed wasteful, all that energy going into a feeling that didn't build anything. But she allowed herself, in the privacy of that bare room, to acknowledge what the day had cost her. The 2,000 miles, the 6 weeks of careful hope, the image she had built in her mind of something better, waiting at the other end of a train ticket. Harrison Aldridge's eyes going over her like a list of deficiencies. A disappointment, She lay back on the bed fully clothed, her boots still on, and stared at the dark ceiling. Somewhere down the hall, she heard a small voice. Clara's, she thought, say something she couldn't make out, and then Cole's lower voice answering, and then quiet. She reached into her coat pocket and found the 2 letters, held them in the dark without reading them. Then she folded them one more time and tucked them under the mattress, and she closed her eyes, and she slept better than she had in 3 days. She would deal with tomorrow when it came. Tomorrow always came. She had told herself 3 days. By the 4th morning, she was still there, and by the end of the 1st week, she had stopped counting. It wasn't a decision she made so much as something that happened around her while she was busy doing other things. There was always something that needed doing on the Bennett Ranch, something broken or empty or neglected that her hands could fix without being asked. The pantry needed organizing. The kitchen window latch was loose and let the cold air in at night. The girls' winter stockings had holes in them that had been patched and repatched until there was more patch than original fabric. Evelyn dealt with these things methodically, one after another, the way she had always dealt with problems. Not because anyone told her to, but because she was constitutionally incapable of walking past a fixable thing and leaving it broken. Cole noticed. He didn't say much about it directly, but she caught him sometimes looking at something she had repaired or reorganized with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not gratitude exactly, more like the look of a man who has been carrying weight so long he's forgotten what it feels like to set something down. The ranch itself was a harder problem than patching stockings. She could see that clearly within the first few days, the way you can see the shape of a problem once you're close enough to it. The land was good. She didn't know much about ranching, but she could see the quality of the grazing pastures, the solid construction of the original barn and outbuildings. What had gone wrong wasn't the land. It was everything that had accumulated on top of it. 3 years of drought had thinned the herd badly. Debt had followed the drought like a second shadow. And running underneath all of it, quieter and more corrosive than either, was the grief that had settled into the house like cold weather that never quite leaves. Cole's wife had died 2 years ago. Evelyn learned this not from Cole, who spoke about almost nothing personal, but from Rose, who had the habit of stating difficult facts with the directness of a child who hasn't yet learned that adults prefer to circle around the hard things. Mama died in winter, Rose told her on the 3rd morning, matter-of-factly, while Evelyn was teaching her to braid her own hair. Papa cried for a long time after. He doesn't cry anymore, but sometimes he goes out to the barn at night when he thinks we're asleep. Evelyn kept her hands moving through the braid. Your papa loves you very much, she said. I know, Rose said, but loving somebody doesn't always mean you know what to do. She paused, considering. He burned the soup. The boot soup, Evelyn agreed. Rose almost smiled at that. Almost. Clara was harder to reach. Where Rose processed the world through observation and direct statement, Claire had gone somewhere quieter inside herself. Not sullen, exactly, but careful in the way of a person who has learned that good things leave and is not interested in being hurt by that again. She watched Evelyn from doorways. She answered questions in short sentences and asked almost none of her own. She ate everything on her plate and said thank you with the mechanical politeness of a child who has been taught manners by someone who understood their importance without being able to explain their warmth. On the 5th day, Evelyn found her sitting alone in the barn, not doing anything in particular, just sitting in the straw with her knees pulled up and her chin resting on them, watching the light come through the gaps in the boards. Evelyn sat down a few feet away. Not too close. She didn't say anything either. They sat like that for a while. You're going to leave, Clara said finally. Not accusatory, just stating a fact she had already decided on. I don't know what I'm going to do yet, Evelyn said. I haven't decided. Everyone decides to leave eventually. Has everyone left? Clara was quiet for a moment. Mama didn't choose to, but she left anyway. She picked up a piece of straw and turned it in her fingers. The cook left. The man who helped Papa with the horses left. Papa's brother came for a while after Mama died, and then he left too. She set the straw down. People always have reasons. They do, Evelyn agreed. She didn't try to promise anything, because she had learned enough by then to know that promises made too quickly were worth less than no promise at all. I'll tell you before I go, if I go. That's all I can say right now. Clara looked at her for a long moment with those watchful 7-year-old eyes. Okay, she said. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the door to trust left slightly open, and Evelyn understood that was more than Clara gave most people. She went back inside and started dinner. The days fell into a rhythm that Evelyn hadn't asked for, but found herself settling into the way you settle into a chair that wasn't made for you, but is the right height anyway. She was up before the girls, had the stove going and coffee ready by the time Cole came in from the early morning check on the cattle. He drank his coffee standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the land with the expression of a man calculating things he couldn't quite make add up. She started breakfast, and they moved around each other in the kitchen without getting in each other's way, which was not nothing. "You don't have to do all this," he said one morning. "I know," she said. She was cracking eggs into the pan. "I'm doing it anyway." He looked like he was going to say something else, and then decided not to. She appreciated that about him. He didn't fill silence with words just to fill it. Most men she had known either talked too much or not at all, and the ones who talked too much were usually talking about themselves. Cole's silences had a different quality. They were the silences of someone who was thinking, not avoiding. "The fence along the north pasture needs re-stringing," he said instead. "I've been putting it off. That's not something I can help with." "I know. I'm just—" He stopped, drank his coffee. Thinking out loud. "How much fence?" "About 200 yards. Takes a full day at least. Maybe 2. He set the cup down. "Which means I can't be here for—" He gestured vaguely at the house, the girls, all of it. She understood what he was asking without him asking it. "The girls will be fine," she said. Go fix your fence." He looked at her. "You sure?" "I'm here, aren't I?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular careful quality of a man who means something more than what he's saying, "Yeah, you are." She turned back to the eggs before he could see her expression. The fence took 3 days, not 2. During those 3 days, Evelyn ran the house on her own and found that she was better at it than she expected, which surprised her in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had run kitchens before, boarding houses, a brief stint in a hotel in Columbus. But this was different. This was smaller and more immediate. When Rose didn't want to eat her breakfast because her stomach hurt and Evelyn felt her forehead and told her she was fine, just nervous about something she wasn't saying, and turned out to be right. That felt different from feeding 30 strangers. When Clara came downstairs in the middle of the second night, unable to sleep, and Evelyn sat with her at the kitchen table and let her talk about her mother for the first time, haltingly and with long pauses, until she finally ran out of words and her eyes went heavy. That felt like something that mattered in a way that was hard to measure. She wasn't their mother. She wasn't trying to be. But she could sit with them in the dark when they needed it, and sometimes that was enough. Cole came back on the evening of the 3rd day, tired and covered in the particular grime of outdoor labor, and found Evelyn at the stove and both girls at the kitchen table. Rose doing her letters, Clara drawing something on a piece of brown paper with a stub of charcoal. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at it. "How'd the fence go?" Evelyn asked without turning around. "Got it done." He came in and hung his hat. "How were they?" "Fine," she said. "Clara's been drawing. Rose read 3 pages of the primer by herself this afternoon." He crossed to the table and looked at what Clara was drawing. It was the mountains, rough and childlike but recognizable, the particular shape of the peaks visible from the kitchen window. "That's good, Clara Bear," he said quietly. Clara looked up at him with an expression that was still careful, but had something new in it, something that had been there since the nighttime conversation at the kitchen table, a fractional softening, like ice that isn't melting yet, but has started to consider the possibility. "Evelyn showed me how to do the shadows," she said. Cole glanced at Evelyn's back. She was stirring something on the stove and pretending not to have heard. He sat down, pulled his boots off with the weariness of a man who has been on his feet for 3 days, and said nothing more about it. But that night after the girls were in bed, he came back to the kitchen where she was cleaning up and he stood in the doorway again. He had a habit of doorways, she had noticed, like he was always checking whether he was welcome before committing to the room. And he said, "You've been good with them." She wrung out the dishcloth and hung it. "They're easy to be good with." "They're not, actually." His voice was honest without being harsh. "They haven't been. Not for a while." He looked at the table where Clara's drawing still sat. Clara hasn't drawn anything since her mother died. Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. Then, She just needed someone to show her the shadows. Cole looked at her for a long moment. In the lamplight, with the tiredness on his face and the day's work still in his hands, he looked like a man who had been doing his absolute best for a long time and was only now, cautiously, beginning to wonder if his best might be enough. "I can pay you something," he said. "Not much, but something." "We can talk about that later," she said. "Go to bed, Cole. You look like you're about to fall over." The corner of his mouth moved. "Is that your professional opinion?" "It's my observation." He picked up Clara's drawing from the table very carefully and took it with him when he went upstairs. The weeks gathered themselves into a month. October came down from the mountains with real cold in it. Not the testing cold of September, but the settled, certain cold of a season that intends to stay. Evelyn had grown up with Ohio winters, which were wet and gray and unpleasant. But there was nothing in Ohio that had prepared her for the quality of cold that came off the Colorado Rockies at altitude. A clean, iron cold that got into your lungs when you breathed and made every living thing feel sharply, undeniably present. She sent Cole into town for wool and spent 3 evenings re-knitting the girls' stockings properly, which Rose accepted with genuine pleasure and Clara accepted by putting them on immediately and not taking them off for 2 days. She mended Cole's work coat where the lining had gone, found extra firewood stacked under a tarp behind the barn that he had apparently forgotten about, and began spending the long evenings after dinner teaching Rose and Clara from the old reader she had found in a trunk under the stairs. The reading lessons became something she had not expected them to become. Rose took to letters the way some children take to water, naturally, instinctively, not fighting it. By the 3rd week, she was sounding out words she hadn't been taught, making connections on her own. Her face lit from inside when she got something right. Clara was slower and more careful and had the particular frustration of a child who wants to be perfect at things immediately and cannot stand the process of being bad at them first. But she was stubborn in a way that was going to serve her eventually, and by the end of October she was reading simple sentences. "What does this say?" Clara pointed to a line in the reader one evening. Her forehead creased in concentration. Evelyn leaned over. "The river runs to the sea." Clara studied it. "Why does it run? Rivers don't have legs." "It's a way of describing how rivers move," Evelyn said, "fast and always going forward." "Like a person running away?" Evelyn paused. "More like a person running towards something." Clara considered this. She looked at the page for a long time. Then she read the sentence herself, slowly, her finger under each word. "The river runs to the sea." "That's right." "I did it," Clara said. It came out quiet, almost private, like she hadn't meant to say it out loud. "You did," Evelyn said. Clara looked up at her, and for just a moment the carefulness dropped completely. And she was just a little girl who had done a hard thing and needed someone to see it. "I did it," she said again, louder this time. From across the table, Rose said, without looking up from her own page, "I heard you the first time." "Rose," Evelyn said. "She did do it," Rose said, looking up. "I'm just saying I heard." But there was something in her voice that wasn't dismissal. It was the particular pride of an older sister who would never in her life admit directly that she was proud of her younger twin. Cole had been listening from the doorway. She knew he was there. She had heard his boots on the stairs. And when she glanced over, he was looking at his daughters with an expression that hit her somewhere underneath her ribs before she had time to prepare for it. He was a man trying very hard not to fall apart from gratitude. She looked back at the table quickly. There were things she was not going to let herself think about, and he was becoming one of them. But this was the thing about proximity, about daily life shared with people, the accumulation of small moments, the 10,000 unremarkable transactions of a day that build, brick by brick, into something neither of you planned. She had arrived at this ranch with nothing and no plan and no claim on anything here. She had told herself she was staying temporarily. She had meant it. What she hadn't counted on was that the ranch would need her, specifically, not just a warm body to cook and clean, but her, the particular person she was. Her patience with Clara's stubbornness, her willingness to sit with Rose's seriousness and take it at face value rather than trying to make her cheerful. The way she had learned, without thinking about it, to leave Cole to his silences and only speak into them when she had something worth saying. And she hadn't counted on needing it back. She had been self-sufficient for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be in a place where people noticed when she came in from outside and seemed, in their different ways, to be glad about it. In the first week of November, everything went sideways. She was in the kitchen when she heard a horse in the yard, and Cole's voice change, not loudly, but in the particular way it changed when something had put him on guard. She looked out the kitchen window and saw a rider she didn't recognize at first, sitting on a horse that cost more than the Bennett Ranch was probably worth. Then he turned, and she recognized the set of those shoulders, the gray-streaked beard, the small, assessing eyes. Harrison Aldridge. She stood very still at the window. He was speaking to Cole, and she couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language clearly enough. The relaxed authority of a man who is used to owning every conversation he enters, and the controlled tension of Cole, who was not moving backward but not advancing either, hands at his sides, jaw set. After a minute, Cole said something short. Aldridge replied. Cole pointed toward the road, the unmistakable gesture of someone ending a conversation and indicating a direction. Aldridge looked at the house. He looked directly at the kitchen window. She stepped back from the glass, her heart going fast in a way that surprised her with its intensity. She had not thought about Harrison Aldridge in weeks. She had been too busy. She had been too present in this life, in this kitchen, in these days. She had almost started to believe that a man who rejected her on a train platform would simply go back to his business and forget she existed. But men like Harrison Aldridge didn't forget things they considered theirs. Aldridge said one more thing to Cole, and even through the glass, even at that distance, she could see the quality of it. Not a statement, a warning. Then he turned his horse and rode out of the yard at an unhurried walk. Cole stood where he was until the horse had gone from sight. Then he turned toward the house, and when he came inside, his face had the particular closed-off look she had seen before, the look of a man managing something. "What did he want?" she asked. Cole took off his hat, set it on the table, sat down. "He says you owe him money." His voice was careful, factual. "For the train ticket." She stared at him. "The advertisement said he'd pay for the ticket." "I know. He offered it. I didn't ask." "I know, Evelyn." He said her name with a steadiness that wasn't dismissal. "I'm telling you what he said, not what I believe." He looked at her. "He says if you don't settle the debt, he'll have the sheriff out here." "The sheriff?" Her voice was flat. "His sheriff." "Ed Marsh has been taking Aldridge money for 4 years, Cole said. He's not going to look at a piece of paper and decide justice has been done." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Outside, the wind was picking up off the mountains, rattling the kitchen window in its frame. "He's done this before," she said. It wasn't a question. Cole was quiet for a beat too long. "There was a woman named Ruth Casper," he said finally, 3 years ago. "She came out on the train to marry him. He rejected her at the station, same as you. 3 weeks later, he had her brought up on some debt charge, had her threatened out of town." He paused. "I don't know where she went." The cold from the window was working its way into the kitchen. Evelyn noticed it distantly, the way you notice weather when you're thinking about something else. "Why?" she asked. "Because he could," Cole said simply. "Because in this part of the territory, Harrison Aldridge can do most things he decides to do." He looked at her steadily. "But he can't force you off this property. Not today. Not without a legal process that takes time." "And what happens at the end of that process?" "I don't know." He was honest when he said it, which she appreciated even though it wasn't what she wanted to hear. "I don't have money for lawyers. I don't have connections in the county seat." He set his hands flat on the table. "What I have is this ranch and the fact that you're here legal and above board and haven't done a single thing wrong." She looked at his hands on the table. Large, work-scarred, the hands of a man who solved problems physically when he could and couldn't figure out what to do with problems that couldn't be solved that way. "You could ask me to leave," she said. "It would be simpler for you." "Yeah," he said, "it would be." He didn't say anything else. He picked his hat back up and put it on, and he stood up from the table with the look of a man who has made a decision and is done deliberating about it. "I'll be in the barn if you need me," he said. She sat at the table for a long time after he went out, listening to the wind push at the house and the ordinary sounds of the ranch settling around her in the growing dark. The stove ticked. Somewhere upstairs, one of the girls moved across the floor. She thought about Ruth Casper, who had come on a train and disappeared. She thought about the $6 still in her coat pocket. No, less now. She had spent some at the general store in town. She thought about the road back to the station and the train that ran west and the city at the end of it where she knew no one and had nothing waiting. She thought about Clara reading her first sentence. The river runs to the sea. She got up and started dinner. Running toward something, she had said. Not away. She wasn't entirely sure yet what she was running toward, but she was beginning to understand, in the quiet, particular way you understand things that sneak up on you when you're too busy to defend against them, that leaving had stopped being the plan somewhere between the boot soup and Claire's drawing and the way Cole said her name when he wanted her to know he believed her. She wasn't leaving. She just wasn't ready to say that out loud yet. Aldridge didn't come back the next day or the day after that. He let the silence do its work, which Evelyn understood was the point. Men like him knew that waiting was its own kind of pressure, that the mind would fill the silence with worse things than he could manufacture himself, that fear, given enough room, would eventually do his job for him. She refused to give it that room. She kept moving. She kept cooking, kept teaching the girls, kept fixing the small broken things around the house that accumulated with the quiet persistence of entropy. Cole noticed that she was sleeping less. He was up early enough to know she had often been at the stove for an hour before he came down, but he didn't push at it. He had enough sense to understand that she was working through something and that questions would not help. What she was working through was this. She had spent most of her adult life being afraid of the wrong things. She had been afraid of poverty, and poverty had come anyway. She had been afraid of loneliness, and she had been lonelier in a room full of people in Columbus than she was on this wind-hammered ranch with 2 children and a man who burned soup. She had been afraid of making the wrong choice, so she had made no choice at all for years, washing other people's dishes, sleeping in other people's houses, waiting for something to change without being willing to be the thing that changed. She was done waiting. What she hadn't worked out yet was what done waiting looked like in practical terms, given that Harrison Aldridge had a corrupt sheriff and 400 acres and the kind of money that turned the law into a personal errand service. The answer came from an unexpected direction, the way answers sometimes do. It was Cole's neighbor, a rancher named Pete Grady, who showed up one afternoon in the second week of November with information he said she needed to hear. Pete was a lean, sun-dried man in his 60s who spoke in the compressed way of someone who had spent decades saying only what was necessary. He came in, accepted coffee, declined to sit down, and stood at the kitchen window turning his hat in his hands. Aldridge is telling people in town you're a confidence woman, he said. Says you answered the advertisement under false pretenses. That you misrepresented yourself. He glanced at Evelyn. I'm telling you because you should know what's being said, not because I believe it. Evelyn set her coffee cup down carefully. What else? She asked, because she could tell from the way he was still turning the hat that there was more. He's been talking to Judge Calloway over in Ridgecrest. Pete looked at Cole. The judge owes Aldridge money from a land deal 3 years ago, the kind of debt that gets repaid in favors. He paused. There's talk of a formal debt summons. If it gets filed, she'd have to appear in Ridgecrest. Aldridge has friends on that road. The kitchen was very quiet. Friends? Cole repeated. His voice had gone flat in the way it did when he was keeping something controlled. I'm not saying anything specific, Pete said carefully. I'm saying that road between here and Ridgecrest is 40 miles of not much, and women traveling it alone have had trouble before. He finally put his hat on. Market day in Black Hollow is Saturday. Aldridge will be there. He's always there, likes the audience. He looked at Evelyn. If something's going to be said publicly, that's the place to say it, before he gets the paperwork filed. He left without finishing his coffee. Evelyn stood at the window and watched his wagon go down the road, and she thought about Ruth Casper again. She thought about what Pete hadn't said specifically, that women who crossed Harrison Aldridge on an empty road tended to disappear from the accounting of things. She thought about the advertisement in the Gazette, the careful letters, the train ticket, the photograph of a man standing in front of a house, the whole construction of it, the deliberate luring of women who had nothing and wanted something better, and the systematic destruction of them when they arrived. She thought about all the names she didn't know, all the women who had come before Ruth Casper. No, she said. Cole, who was still sitting at the table, looked at her. No to what? She turned around. I'm not going to wait for him to file papers and manufacture a debt I don't owe and have me brought up before a judge he owns. Her voice was steady in a way she had to work for. If I'm going to fight this, I'm going to fight it where people can see it. Cole was quiet for a moment. Market day, he said. Market day. He looked at her for a long time. She could see him calculating the risk, the odds, the various ways it could go wrong. Cole Bennett was a man who thought before he moved, which was not a quality she had always valued in people, but had come to understand was different from cowardice. He wasn't afraid of Aldridge. He was thinking about whether this was the right ground to fight on. He'll have his men with him, Cole said. He always has his men with him. Ed Marsh will side with him. Ed Marsh always sides with him. She held his gaze. Cole, he's going to move against me whether I do something or not. The only question is whether I let him choose the time and the place, or I choose it. Cole picked up his coffee cup, put it down without drinking from it. What are you going to say? The truth. She paused. All of it. He rubbed the back of his neck. A gesture she had learned meant he had already made up his mind and was just finishing the process of accepting it. All right, he said. Saturday. She nodded and went back to the stove, and neither of them said anything more about it that evening. But when she was cleaning up later, she found that he had left a piece of paper on the table with a name written on it. A lawyer in Black Hollow named Silas Grubb, who Cole said would be at the market, who had a long and public dislike of Harrison Aldridge rooted in some dispute over water rights 3 years prior. Below the name was a note in Cole's angular handwriting. He doesn't like Aldridge. That might matter. It was a small thing. But it was the kind of small thing that meant he had been thinking about it since Pete left, working the problem quietly while she worked the stove, each of them doing what they did. Both of them pointed in the same direction. She folded the paper and kept it. Saturday arrived with the particular gray clarity of a November morning at altitude, the sky a flat white sheet pulled tight across the mountains. They left the ranch early, the 4 of them in the wagon, the girls in the back wrapped in wool blankets. Clara had been quiet since she understood something serious was happening, and Rose had asked one direct question at breakfast. Is it going to be dangerous? And accepted maybe a little without further argument, which was either a sign of courage or a sign that she had inherited her father's habit of getting on with things, regardless of the odds. Black Hollow's market day was the social hub of the territory, which meant that by mid-morning, the main street was crowded in the particular way of a place where people didn't have many alternatives. Farmers, ranchers, shopkeepers, wives, children, dogs, at least 3 men playing instruments badly near the general store, and the general low roar of commerce and conversation overlapping. Under normal circumstances, Evelyn might have found it almost pleasant. She spotted Aldridge's wagon before they had finished hitching their own horse. He had come with 2 men she didn't recognize and was holding court near the center of the street, talking to a group of local merchants with the comfortable authority of a man who expected to be listened to. He hadn't seen her yet. She found Silas Grubb first, because she had been looking for him. He was a small man, narrow-shouldered, with wire spectacles and the ink-stained fingers of someone who spent most of his time with paperwork. He looked at her over his spectacles when Cole introduced her. He's telling people you're a fraud, Grubb said without preamble. I know, she said. I have his letters. She reached into her coat and produced them. Both letters from Aldridge, the advertisement torn from the Columbus Gazette, and her own letters to him, which she had retrieved from under the mattress in the spare room the morning after she arrived. She had been carrying them all, she realized, since the moment she stepped off the train. She had not known until this moment that she had been holding them for exactly this purpose. Grubb took them and read them in the particular rapid way of a lawyer, his eyes moving fast across the lines. When he finished, he looked up. These are fairly clear, he said. They're completely clear, she said. He looked at her for a moment. You know he'll say they're fabricated. He can say whatever he likes. She took the letters back. I just want people to hear the truth before he manages to bury it in paperwork. Grubb folded his spectacles and put them in his pocket. I'll be nearby, he said, which, from a man of his apparent verbal economy, she took to mean he intended to be useful. She found Cole where she had left him, standing with the wagon and the girls. He looked at her face and read whatever was on it without asking. Now? He said. Now, she said. She walked across the market street toward Harrison Aldridge, with her letters in her hand and her heart hitting the inside of her chest with a force she suspected was audible. This was the thing she had not fully admitted to herself until this moment. She was frightened. Not of Aldridge specifically, not of his hired men or his corrupt sheriff, but of the particular kind of public humiliation that follows a woman who has already been publicly humiliated once. She had stood on this same street, well, near this street, at the station, 6 weeks ago, while a man picked her apart in front of strangers. She had survived it. She was not confident she could survive a second version of it. She kept walking. Aldridge saw her coming when she was about 20 feet away. Something moved across his face. Surprise, quickly contained, and then something uglier replacing it. He said something to the men beside him, and they shifted slightly, a positioning that was casual enough to be deniable and deliberate enough that she noticed. "Miss Harper," Aldridge said. His voice was the public voice, performatively pleasant, pitched for the people around them. "I'm surprised you're still in the county." "I expect you are," she said. She stopped about 8 feet away, far enough that he couldn't crowd her physically, close enough that she didn't have to raise her voice. The people nearby had started to pay attention. Not all of them. Not yet. But enough. "I want to address something you've been saying around town." "I've been saying a great many things," he said, with the smile of a man who is confident he controls the situation. "You'll have to be specific." "That I misrepresented myself in my letters to you." She held up the small sheaf of papers. "I have both of your letters to me, my 2 letters to you, and the advertisement you placed in the Columbus Gazette. Anyone who wants to read them is welcome to." The smile stayed, but his eyes changed. "Letters can be fabricated by anyone with a pen." "They can," she agreed, "which is why I'd like to point out that your letter to me is written on paper with your ranch's name printed at the top, which I imagine is somewhat difficult to fabricate in Columbus, Ohio, where I lived until 6 weeks ago." She paused. "I also want to say publicly, so that no one here is confused, I don't owe you money, Mr. Aldridge. You offered to pay for my ticket in writing. I have the letter that says so. Any debt claim made against me will be answered with these documents in whatever court chooses to hear them." The crowd had grown. Not dramatically, people drifted rather than rushed, but the circle around them had widened. She was aware of Cole somewhere at the edge of it. She was aware of the 2 men near Aldridge who were watching her with a flat attention she didn't like. And then she heard Sheriff Marsh's voice from somewhere behind her. "Miss Harper." He sounded bored, which was how he sounded when he was about to do something unpleasant on someone else's behalf. "I think you'd better let her speak." The voice was unexpected enough that Marsh stopped talking. Evelyn turned slightly. A woman had stepped into the circle. A woman she had never seen before, somewhere in her 50s, dressed well but not extravagantly, with Aldridge's jaw and his small eyes turned sharp in a completely different direction. Beside her was a younger woman, perhaps 25, who looked like she had been crying recently and was doing her best to hide it. Aldridge's face had gone very still. "Aunt Margaret," he said. His public voice had changed. "Not much, but enough." "Harrison." Margaret Aldridge looked at her nephew with an expression Evelyn recognized from her years reading people in boarding houses and kitchens. It was the expression of someone who has been carrying a long anger and has finally decided to put it down by throwing it. "I think you've caused enough trouble for women who didn't deserve it. This isn't your concern. Ruth Casper is my concern." Margaret's voice was clear and level and loud enough for the crowd. "Clara Hendricks before her, Mary Weston before her." She paused, each name its own sentence. "I've been watching you do this for 15 years, Harrison, bringing women out here and throwing them away when they don't suit you, and then hunting them down when they don't disappear quietly enough." She glanced at the young woman beside her. "Your sister has been keeping records, because someone had to." The young woman, his sister apparently, was crying now, not hiding it anymore. She had a small journal in her hands, pressed against her chest like something she'd decided to either carry or burn and had chosen at the last minute to carry. Aldridge took a step toward them. Cole moved. He was at Evelyn's side in the time it took to register his absence, and his presence alone, not aggressive, not posturing, just the physical fact of a man who had decided where he was going to stand, was enough to stop Aldridge mid-step. "Don't," Cole said quietly. Just the one word. Marsh had gone from bored to uncomfortable, which was its own information. Margaret Aldridge looked at the crowd with the focus of a woman who understood that this moment mattered and intended to use every second of it. "My nephew has been defrauding women in 3 counties," she said. "He has been filing false debt claims, bribing public officials, and when those methods failed—" She stopped, composing herself with visible effort. "Ruth Casper left this county because 2 of his men followed her buggy for 30 miles until she turned around and went back east. She never stopped being afraid." She looked at Evelyn directly for the first time. "I should have done this a long time ago. I'm sorry it took another woman standing in front of him for me to finally do it." Evelyn said nothing. She didn't know what to say. She had come here expecting to fight alone, and she found she had no architecture for not fighting alone. What happened next was not like the stories. It was not sudden or dramatic or clean. Aldridge did not crumble. He straightened up, looked at the crowd with the calculating eyes of a man still looking for an angle, and for a moment she thought he was going to find one. He had money and influence, and half the county owed him something. But his aunt was still standing there, and his sister was still holding that journal. And Silas Grubb had materialized from somewhere in the crowd with his ink-stained fingers and his wire spectacles, and he was talking to Marsh in a low and evidently persuasive way that involved several references to documents in the county seat. And she caught at least once the word federal. Marsh looked at Aldridge. Aldridge looked at Marsh. Something passed between them. The renegotiation of a relationship, she understood. The moment when a man who has been someone's instrument calculates whether the instrument is still more valuable than the alternative. It was not a moment of justice. Justice was slower and messier than a moment. But it was a shift. The kind of shift that happens in public, in front of witnesses, that cannot be entirely undone afterward. Then it broke entirely. Aldridge moved fast for his size. She hadn't expected that. He was past Cole before Cole could fully turn, and his hand closed around her arm with a grip that was going to leave marks. And he said through his teeth, very quietly, so only she could hear it, "You have made a very serious mistake." She did not flinch. "Let go of my arm," she said. "You think these people are going to help you?" "Mr. Aldridge." She held his eyes. "Let go of my arm." He didn't. And for one genuine second she thought this was going to end badly, in the middle of the street, in front of everyone. Then from behind him, cutting through the noise of the crowd, small, high, unafraid, "Please don't hurt her." It was Clara. She was standing at the edge of the crowd, where Cole had left her and Rose with the wagon. She had pushed through to the front somehow, and she was standing there in her mended dress and her proper wool stockings, her hands at her sides, looking at Aldridge with the direct, serious eyes she usually kept so carefully guarded. "Please don't hurt her," she said again. "Please don't make her go away." Aldridge stared at her. He was a man without sentiment. She had understood that about him from the beginning. But even he seemed momentarily unable to process a 7-year-old's uncomplicated plea in the middle of a crowd that was watching every move he made. His grip loosened. Cole hit him on the next breath. Not a wild swing, a deliberate, targeted blow that dropped Aldridge to the dirt and sent the men beside him scrambling backward. Cole's hand was bleeding from the impact, which told her everything about how hard it had landed. He stood over Aldridge, breathing hard, and looked down at him with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not anger, not righteousness, just absolute flat certainty. "Get up and leave," Cole said. "Leave this town, leave this county, and stay away from my family." The crowd had gone almost completely silent. Aldridge got up. Slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who is injured and furious and conscious of being watched. He looked at Cole. He looked at Evelyn. He looked briefly and strangely at Clara, who was still standing at the edge of the crowd with her chin lifted. He did not say anything. He walked to his horse, mounted with difficulty, and rode out of Black Hollow without looking back. Marsh was already in conversation with Grubb and appeared to be having a terrible time of it. Margaret Aldridge crossed the emptied space between them and stopped in front of Evelyn. Up close, she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day. A deep, accumulated tiredness. "He won't come back," she said. "Not after today. He doesn't have the stomach for a public fight when the public isn't on his side anymore." She paused. "We'll give those documents to the county sheriff, the real one, over in Ridgecrest, not Marsh." Her eyes moved briefly to Grubb. Your lawyer will know what to do with them. He's not my lawyer, Evelyn said. He is now, Margaret said with the dry finality of someone who has decided how things are going to be arranged. She looked at Evelyn for a moment longer. You stood up well, she said. Better than I did for a long time. Then she turned and went back to her nephew's sister, took the young woman's arm, and walked out of the circle. Cole was at Evelyn's side. He had his hand wrapped in a handkerchief that was already going red. Are you all right? She asked. Fine, he said, in the way men say fine when they are clearly not fine but are not interested in discussing it. Your hand. I know. He looked at Clara, who had been collected by Rose and was now standing between them. He crouched down to Clara's level. That was brave, he said quietly. What you did. Clara looked at him, then at Evelyn. Her face did the thing it sometimes did, that fractional softening. I didn't want her to go, she said simply. Evelyn put her hand on Clara's shoulder. She didn't have words for what was in her chest at that moment. Not gratitude exactly, not relief. Something that went deeper than both of those things. Something she was going to need more time and more distance to name properly. Rose, standing beside her sister with her arms crossed and her usual expression of 11-year-old certainty, said, Can we get food now? I'm hungry. Cole made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something else entirely, and stood up and looked at Evelyn over the girls' heads. She looked back at him. His hand was still bleeding. The crowd was slowly returning to the noise of ordinary market day around them. The mountains were doing what they always did, which was exist at an enormous, indifferent scale that made everything happening below them seem both meaningless and strangely precious. Come on, Cole said. Let's go find something to eat. They walked down the main street of Black Hollow together, the four of them, and nobody said anything important for a while, and the silence between them had a completely different quality than it had ever had before. It had the quality, she thought, of something that had been tested and held. The ride home from Black Hollow was quieter than the ride in, but it was a different kind of quiet. The girls fell asleep in the wagon bed before they had cleared the last edge of town. Rose with her head on her folded coat, Clara with her cheek pressed against the side panel in a way that was going to leave a red mark. And Evelyn and Cole sat in the front with the reins and the cold air, and the long blue shadow of the mountains stretching out ahead of them. Cole's hand had been properly wrapped by then, a clean strip of linen from the dry goods store, and he drove with it resting on his knee rather than gripping the reins, which meant he was managing with one hand and not saying anything about it. She watched him do this for a while and decided not to comment. He would ask for help if he needed it. That, she had learned, was the kind of man he was. Grubb thinks the county sheriff will move within the week, Cole said, after they had gone about a mile. Once he sees Margaret's documents and the letters. And Marsh? Marsh is going to find that being Harrison Aldridge's friend is suddenly less profitable than it used to be. He kept his eyes on the road. Pete Grady has been waiting for an excuse to bring a complaint against him for 3 years. He'll have company now. She nodded. The information settled into her without producing the relief she might have expected. It was good news. She believed it was good news, but she had been waiting for the other side of good news long enough to know that problems like Aldridge didn't resolve cleanly. They frayed and unraveled over time, and you had to keep your hands on the loose ends until it was genuinely finished. He could still cause trouble, she said. He could, Cole agreed. I'm not assuming it's over. Neither am I. He glanced at her sideways. But today was something. Today was something, she said. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon wheels finding every rut in the road, the mountains going from gray to deep violet as the sun dropped. Behind them, Clara made a small sound in her sleep. Not distress, just the ordinary sounds of a child unconscious and unguarded. And Evelyn turned automatically to check, and saw her lying there with her mouth slightly open, the careful watchfulness entirely gone from her face, just a 7-year-old sleeping after a long day. She turned back. She called you family, Evelyn said. Cole didn't answer immediately. He adjusted the reins. Clara said it first, Evelyn continued carefully. In the street. My family. She paused. That's what you said to Aldridge, too. A long moment. I know what I said, Cole replied. She let it sit. She was not going to push at it. Not tonight, not on this road, not with both of them still carrying the day's weight. But she was aware that something had been named in the middle of that street that had not been named before, and that both of them knew it, and that the space between the saying of it and the meaning of it was something they were going to have to walk across eventually. Not tonight. Tonight the mountains were going dark and the girls were asleep in the wagon, and her arm was bruised where Aldridge's hand had closed around it, and Cole's knuckles were split under the linen wrapping, and none of those things were small, and all of them needed to simply be carried home before anything else. She tucked that conversation away carefully and looked at the road ahead. The weeks after Market Day had a different texture to them. The immediate threat of Aldridge receded slowly, like weather passing, not gone overnight, but day by day losing its urgency. Silas Grubb proved to be as useful as his reputation suggested. Margaret Aldridge, true to her word, turned over her documents to the county sheriff in Ridgecrest, and what followed was a slow, grinding legal process that Grubb managed with a kind of terrier persistence, filing responses, appearing at hearings, building a record that made the invented debt claim evaporate in approximately 3 weeks. Ed Marsh resigned from the sheriff's office in the second week of December under circumstances that the official record described vaguely as a difference of professional opinion and that Pete Grady described, over coffee at the Bennett kitchen table, as getting out before he got pushed. Harrison Aldridge himself disappeared from public life in the county with a thoroughness that surprised Evelyn until she understood it shouldn't have. Men like Aldridge, who built their power on public performance, had nothing to fall back on when the performance failed. His aunt took control of the ranch operations. His sister, whose name was Jane, had moved into the Aldridge house and was, by all accounts, managing things considerably better than her brother had. None of this resolved the deeper damage. The women Aldridge had run off, Ruth Casper, the others Margaret had named, those women were somewhere out in the world carrying what had been done to them, and no legal proceeding was going to change that. Evelyn thought about Ruth Casper more than once in those weeks, turning her name over in her mind like a worry stone. She did not know how to find her. She did not know if Ruth Casper wanted to be found, but she thought about her. December on the Bennett Ranch was hard in the direct physical way that winter was always hard at altitude. Cold that crept through every gap in the walls, water troughs that froze overnight, animals that needed checking more often, a leaking section of the barn roof that Cole patched twice and that still leaked in the right kind of wind. They burned through firewood at a rate that required 2 replenishments of the woodpile before the month was out, and Evelyn learned to bank the kitchen stove at night to hold heat until morning, and the girls slept in the same bed from November onward because their separate rooms were too cold for children, and Cole had not gotten around to putting in a second stove upstairs. What December also was, less expectedly, was good. Evelyn had almost forgotten that it was possible for difficult circumstances to coexist with something that felt, cautiously and without overstatement, like contentment. She had spent too many years operating in survival mode to fully trust the feeling, and she kept waiting for it to be taken away. But it persisted through the cold mornings, and the chores, and the lessons, and the dinners, and the evenings by the stove where Rose read aloud. She had progressed from the primer to a collection of stories Cole had ordered from Denver, and she read with the focused pleasure of a person who has discovered that books are infinite rooms and each one can be entered, while Clara drew in her sketchbook and Cole worked on some piece of harness or equipment that always needed attention. These evenings were ordinary. That was the most accurate thing she could say about them. They were not romantic or picturesque. There was usually someone's dirty boot by the wrong door, and at least one argument between the girls about whose turn it was to bank the stove, and Cole fell asleep in his chair on more nights than she could count, and woke up stiff and irritated with himself about it. But they were ordinary in the specific way of a household that has found its own rhythm, and for a woman who had spent years waiting for ordinariness as though it were a luxury she hadn't earned, the ordinariness itself felt like something. Cole asked her to stay permanently in the first week of January. He did not do it well, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. A smooth, prepared speech would have frightened her. It would have felt like something rehearsed, managed, designed to produce a specific outcome. What he actually did was come in from the barn one evening with snow on his coat and take it off and pour his coffee and stand at the window for so long that she finally said, "Whatever you're working up to, you can just say it." He turned around. He had the hat in hands look, except he wasn't holding his hat. He was holding his coffee cup in both hands like it was giving him something to do with himself. "I'd like you to stay," he said. Not as a housekeeper. Not as the girl's teacher. He paused. I want to be straightforward with you because you deserve straightforward. I care about you. I have for a while, and I've been trying not to make it your problem, but it's gotten to the point where not saying it is its own kind of dishonest. Another pause. I know this isn't what you came out here for. I know the situation when you arrived was... He stopped. Humiliating, she offered. Yeah. He met her eyes. And I'm not asking you to make a decision tonight. I'm not asking you to feel anything you don't feel. He set the coffee cup down. I'd rather have the conversation and know where we stand than keep going around it. She looked at him standing in the lamplight with his split-knuckled hands and his weather-worn face, and the particular quality of expression he got when he had committed himself to something regardless of the outcome. And she thought about the bench at the train station where she had sat with her $6 and her broken plans, and the way he had appeared with two small girls behind him and said, my daughters need someone to believe in us again. And she thought about how she had meant to stay 3 days and had stayed 3 months instead, and about all the ways you can arrive at something without knowing you were traveling toward it. I care about you too, she said. That's been its own kind of problem. He held her gaze. I'm not the same as the man who sent for you, he said. It was important to him. She could see that. Not a plea, just a fact he needed to have on record. Cole, she said, I know that. I've known that since the boot soup. That surprised a short sound out of him. Not quite a laugh, but close. I'm serious, she said. And she was. And he knew it. And the room was warm from the stove, and the girls were upstairs, and the snow was coming down outside in the particular windless way of a heavy snowfall. And she thought, here, this. This is what she had been trying to get to when she got on that train in Columbus. Not this specific house or this specific man. She couldn't have known any of the specifics. But this quality of being somewhere that needed her and where she was needed. This exact texture of ordinary life built with people who were real and imperfect and present. Yes, she said. He blinked. Yes? You asked me to stay. Yes. He stood there for a moment like a man who had prepared extensively for a negotiation that turned out to be shorter than expected. Then something shifted in his face. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a quiet and genuine unwinding of something that had been held tight for a long time. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. They got married in March when the snow had started to pull back from the lower elevations, and the first thin green was showing in the pastures. The ceremony was in a small mountain church at the edge of Black Hollow. Short, practical, witnessed by Pete Grady and his wife, Silas Grubb, and approximately 15 other people who had watched the whole of the preceding months unfold and had formed strong opinions about the outcome. Rose was enormously pleased with herself for having predicted it. Clara stood beside Evelyn during the ceremony and held her hand with both of hers, and when it was over, she said, with the considered gravity of a child making a formal announcement, You're ours now. Evelyn looked down at her. Her throat did something complicated. I'm yours, she confirmed. The marriage did not fix anything structural on the ranch, which would have been too much to ask of a ceremony. The debt was real, and the drought years had done real damage, and Cole's relationship with money was that of a man who understood farming and cattle deeply and bookkeeping barely at all, which meant that the first thing Evelyn did in her formal capacity as Cole's wife was sit down with his accounts and spend 3 days reorganizing them into something that made sense. She found 2 outstanding credits he had forgotten about, a payment schedule on the bank loan that could be renegotiated given recent improvements in the herd, and a supply contract with a merchant in Denver that was costing 30% more than it should have been. You should have looked at these sooner, she told him. I know, he said. He was looking at the organized ledger with an expression somewhere between relief and mortification. This one, she pointed to the supply contract. I need to write a letter. What kind of letter? The kind that gets us a better price. She looked at him. Do you have an objection to that? No, he said. No objection. He watched her write the letter. He had a particular way of watching her work. Not hovering, not directing, just present. Like someone who found it genuinely interesting to observe a person doing something they were good at. She had noticed it before. It was the opposite of the way Harrison Aldridge had looked at her at the train station, and she thought about that contrast sometimes without entirely meaning to. The 2 kinds of attention, one that categorized and found wanting, one that simply watched and seemed to find the watching worthwhile. The letter got them a better price. Cole said nothing about it directly, but that evening he came in with a small bunch of late-blooming wildflowers that were objectively too cold and weathered to be described as a proper bouquet, and set them on the kitchen table without comment. "What are these for?" she asked. "Nothing specific," he said, and went to wash up. She put them in a jar of water and left them on the table for a week. Spring opened the ranch up in ways that winter had kept hidden. The land, she learned, was genuinely beautiful. Not in the manicured way of settled places back east, but in the rougher, larger-scale way of country that had been shaped by forces that didn't consider human convenience. The pastures rolled out from the base of the foothills in great long sweeps of grass that went green and then golden, depending on the light and the hour, and the cattle moved through them with the comfortable purposefulness of animals that knew their landscape. And the girls ran through the same grass on Saturday afternoons while Cole repaired fences and Evelyn planted the kitchen garden she had been planning since February. It was during one of these Saturday afternoons in late April that Jane Aldridge rode out to the ranch. Evelyn saw her from the garden and straightened up, her hands still in the dirt, watching the rider come up the long approach. Cole came out of the barn. The girls, somewhere in the pasture, had not noticed yet. Jane Aldridge dismounted and stopped at a respectful distance. She was younger than she seemed at market day, perhaps 23, with her brother's coloring but without the hardness in the eyes that had defined him. She looked like someone who had been anxious for a long time and was trying to figure out how to stop. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, "I won't take up much of your time." "Get down and come in," Evelyn said. "I'll make coffee." Jane looked momentarily surprised. She glanced at Cole, who gave a brief nod, and she tied her horse to the fence post and came inside. At the kitchen table, with coffee in front of her and the sounds of the girls distant in the pasture, Jane Aldridge looked at her hands for a moment and then looked up. "Ruth Casper wrote to Aunt Margaret," she said. "She's in St. Louis. She's all right." She paused. "She wanted you to know. Aunt Margaret said you'd been wondering." Evelyn felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized was still held. "Thank you," she said. "She also said—" Jane stopped, started again. "She said that what you did at the market, standing up that way. She wanted you to know that she was glad." Her voice had gone a little unsteady. "I was glad too. I should have done something years ago. I didn't know how. Or I told myself I didn't know how, which isn't the same thing." Neither Cole nor Evelyn said anything that would let her off the hook for that because it was true and she seemed to know it, and there was nothing to be gained by pretending otherwise. But Evelyn also didn't add to it. The woman across her table was 23 years old and had lived under her brother's shadow for as long as she could remember, and whatever she had failed to do, she was here now with the information about Ruth Casper, and that was worth something. "Tell her to write to me directly if she'd like," Evelyn said. "I'd be glad to hear from her." Jane nodded. She drank her coffee. She stayed 20 minutes and left without the anxious quality she had come in with. Not transformed, just slightly lighter. The particular lightness of having done the thing you were afraid to do and found it survivable. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window and watched her ride out. "You all right?" Cole asked, coming to stand beside her. "Ruth Casper is in St. Louis," she said. "She's all right." He put a hand on her shoulder briefly. Not a gesture with requirements, just presence. Just acknowledgement. And then he went back outside, and she stood there a moment longer in the kitchen light before she went back to the garden. By summer, the ranch had stabilized enough that Cole hired 2 hands. Not because the finances were flush, they weren't, but because there was enough work that trying to do it without help was costing them more than the wages. One of the men was a quiet Tejano named Ernesto, who had been looking for steady work since a ranching operation south of Denver had collapsed. The other was a boy of about 16 named Will, who was from somewhere east and not forthcoming about why he'd come west alone, which Cole accepted without pressing and Evelyn filed away as something to watch. Will turned out to be a passable hand and an excellent student when Evelyn discovered he could barely read, and began including him in the evening lessons with considerably less ceremony than his evident shame about it required. "You don't have to make it a thing," he told her one evening when he thought no one was listening. "I'm not making it a thing," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. Rose slid him the reader without comment, pointing to the right page. Clara moved her drawing materials over to give him room at the table. By August, Will could read a newspaper from front to back. He never said thank you directly, which she suspected was because he didn't know how to say it, without the kind of emotion that a 16-year-old boy traveling alone was not prepared to display in front of people. But he started helping with firewood without being asked, which was its own kind of language. The ranch was never perfect. The roof still had opinions about heavy rain. The bank loan was manageable but present, a low-grade obligation that required regular attention. One of the horses went lame in August, and the cost of the veterinarian meant that the curtains Evelyn had been meaning to order for the front room had to wait until fall, which Cole seemed genuinely more bothered by than she was. "They're just windows," she said. "You've been looking at bare windows since September," he said. "I've been looking at mountains since September," she said. "The windows are fine." He ordered the curtains anyway, which arrived in October and were the wrong color, which she laughed about for longer than was entirely warranted. It was in October, 3 weeks after the curtains arrived in their wrong color, that she realized she was pregnant. She sat with the knowledge alone for 2 days before she told Cole, not because she was afraid of his reaction, but because she needed to hold it by herself first, to turn it over and look at it from all angles, and decide what she actually felt about it before other people's feelings entered the equation. She was 32 years old. She had not, until coming to Colorado, believed that this was part of what her life would hold. She had set that possibility down in the boarding house in Columbus like something too heavy to keep carrying, and she had not permitted herself to pick it back up. She told him on a Wednesday evening, after the girls were in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them. He was still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and covered her hands with his, said nothing for a while. "Are you scared?" he finally asked. "Yes," she said. "Me too," he said. She looked at him. "You don't have to say that. I'm not saying it to comfort you," he said. "I'm saying it because it's true." He turned her hands over in his. "We'll be scared together then." She thought about all the things being scared together was and wasn't. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a guarantee. It was exactly what it sounded like. Two people facing the same uncertain thing without pretending the uncertainty wasn't there. It was, she thought, exactly right. She told the girls the following Saturday morning at breakfast. Rose received the information with the careful, analytical expression she used for things that required processing, asked 3 logistical questions about sleeping arrangements, and then said she thought it was probably good. Clara listened to all of it without expression, then pushed back from the table, came around to where Evelyn was sitting, and wrapped both arms around her from behind in a hug that had nothing careful or measured about it at all. Evelyn put her hands over Clara's arms and held on. "You're not going to leave," Clara said. Not a question this time, just the plain statement of a child who has finally, at the bottom of herself, stopped preparing for abandonment. "No," Evelyn said. "I'm not going to leave." Outside, the October light was doing what October light did in Colorado. That particular low gold that came through at an angle and lit the tops of the mountains in a way that made them look briefly lit from inside. The kitchen was warm. Will was somewhere outside doing the morning work, and she could hear Ernesto's low voice in the yard. Cole was sitting across the table watching his daughter hug his wife with the expression of a man who has been given more than he had any right to expect and knows it. She caught his eye over Clara's head. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, that steady, particular attention that said nothing dramatic and meant everything. She looked back. The ranch wasn't what she had imagined when she answered an advertisement in a Columbus Gazette. It was not a prosperous 400 acres with a solid house and hired men and the smooth promised surface of a better life. It was harder than that, and colder, and more expensive, and it leaked when it rained and ran short of firewood in the worst weeks, and asked more from her physically than anything she had ever done before. It was also more than she had imagined, in all the ways that mattered. She had come west looking for a life. She had found one. Not the one she planned, the one she built day by ordinary day, with her own hands and these particular people in this particular place. The curtains were the wrong color. The roof still had opinions. Clara's boots were already getting too small for her growing feet, and Rose had decided she wanted to learn how to ride properly, and had been campaigning for it with relentless persistence for 3 weeks. These were the things that needed doing next. She was already thinking about how to do them. The boy was born in June, on a Tuesday, during a thunderstorm that came off the mountains so fast it caught everyone unprepared, including the midwife, who arrived with her coat soaked through and her bag of instruments dripping and said, "Well, babies don't wait for weather," with the philosophical calm of a woman who had delivered half the children in the county and had stopped being surprised by the conditions under which they chose to arrive. They named him James. Not after anyone in particular. Cole had suggested it quietly one evening, and Evelyn had held it in her mind for a few days and found that it fit, the way certain names fit before you can explain why. James Bennett, a short, plain name for a child who came into the world at altitude, in a thunderstorm, in a house with wrong-colored curtains, and a roof that still had opinions. He was small and extremely loud and had Cole's dark coloring, and Evelyn's habit of regarding unfamiliar situations with deep suspicion before accepting them. Rose declared him interesting. Clara held him with the concentrated care of someone handling something irreplaceable and did not put him down for 40 minutes, at which point Evelyn gently removed him on the grounds that her arms existed and also needed to hold her son. Cole sat on the edge of the bed that evening after the midwife had gone, and the girls had finally been convinced to sleep, and he looked at James, who was asleep on Evelyn's chest with the total unconscious confidence of a newborn who has no opinion yet about whether the world deserves his trust. And he was quiet for a long time. "Third child," he said finally. "Still don't know what I'm doing." "Nobody does," Evelyn said. "Rose and Clara at least came with some practice already built in." He watched James breathe. "He's so small. He'll get bigger." "That's what worries me." He leaned over and pressed his mouth briefly to her forehead. Not a romantic gesture, just presence, just the physical shorthand of a man who was not naturally given to speeches. "You did well," he said. "I had some help," she said dryly. He almost smiled at that. Almost. She lay back and looked at the ceiling and listened to the tail end of the storm moving east, the thunder growing smaller, the rain tapping out its last rhythms on the roof. The roof, she noted, appeared to be holding tonight. She chose to take that as a positive sign about nothing in particular. Outside, the world was wet and dark and several thousand feet above sea level, and tomorrow would require the same things every tomorrow on this ranch required: work and attention, and the particular kind of stubborn optimism that was less like hope and more like a daily decision. She understood that now, in a way she hadn't when she stepped off the train in Black Hollow. She had thought then that optimism was something you either had or didn't, some quality of personality distributed unevenly at birth. She knew now it was more like a practice. You got up and did the work and treated the day as worth the effort, and sometimes that was very hard, and sometimes it was easier, and the cumulative weight of all those days was what a life actually was. James made a small sound against her chest. "Hello," she said quietly, to no one in particular and to all of them. The years that followed did not slow down the way she had half expected them to. She had some notion, absorbed from she wasn't sure where, that once your life settled into its proper shape, it would feel more contained, more predictable. That the days would stop surprising you with what they asked for. That particular notion turned out to be wrong in every direction. The work of building something that lasted asked more from her at 35 than it had at 32, and more at 37 than at 35. The ranch demanded constant negotiation between what it needed and what they had to give it, and those two quantities rarely matched cleanly. There were good years and lean years. The drought came back the winter James was 3, and they lost 12 head of cattle to it, and Cole spent 3 weeks that January recalculating every number in the ledgers with the expression of a man rearranging a house fire. They came through it because the accounts Evelyn had organized 4 years prior had built in enough margin to absorb the loss without losing the land, and because Ernesto, who had stayed on and become indispensable in ways nobody had formally planned, found grazing land on a neighbor's property and negotiated a 3-month use agreement without being asked. The hard years were hard. That was true, and she never tried to make it untrue. But somewhere in the middle of those years, without a ceremony or a declaration, something had shifted in what the ranch was. Evelyn could not have named the exact moment when the Bennett property stopped being a struggling cattle operation trying to survive and started being something that the territory around it organized itself toward. It happened incrementally, the way rivers change course, not in a single dramatic event, but in the slow accumulation of small pressures over time. It started with the women. The first one arrived in the spring, when James was almost 2. Her name was Frances Doyle, and she had come out west to join a husband who turned out not to exist in the way she had been told he existed. A variation on a story Evelyn recognized with the exhausted familiarity of a pattern she had been watching for years. Frances arrived at the Black Hollow station with nothing and no plan and sat on the same bench where Evelyn had once sat, and the station master, a man named Herb, who had been there the day of Evelyn's arrival and had never entirely forgiven himself for saying nothing, sent word out to the Bennett ranch. Evelyn drove in herself and brought Frances home without much conversation about it. She stayed for 2 months. She helped with the garden and the kitchen, and she and Evelyn talked in the evenings after the children were in bed. Long, honest conversations of the kind that are only possible between people who have experienced variations of the same specific wound. When Frances left, she went to Denver, where she had a cousin, with a letter from Evelyn addressed to a dressmaker there, and $20 that Frances tried to refuse and Evelyn declined to take back. The second woman arrived 3 months later. Then a third. Cole watched this development with the particular expression he used for things he had decided to support without fully understanding. He did not ask whether they could afford it, which she appreciated, because the answer was complicated and he already knew it. What he said instead, one evening when the fourth woman, a former school teacher named Dorothy, who had been following a man who turned out to be married, had been at the ranch for a week, was, "We're going to need another room." Evelyn looked at him. "The lean-to off the back of the barn," he said. "If we extend it and put in a proper floor and a stove, it'd sleep too comfortably." She held his gaze. "That's a significant amount of work." "Yeah," he said. "Grubb thinks we can file it as a charitable operation for tax purposes, if we do it properly." She stared at him. "You talked to Grubb about this?" "I've been thinking about it since Frances." He shrugged, with the self-consciousness of a man who is embarrassed by his own decency. It seemed like where things were going. She thought about saying something about that, about what it meant that he had gone to Grubb and had the conversation and come back and presented it to her as a practical proposal rather than a grand gesture. She decided the thinking of it was enough. She didn't need to say it. "We'll need help with the building," she said. "Pete said he'd come. Will said he'd come. I figure a week's work with enough hands." 2 weeks, she said. "If you want it done right." 2 weeks, he agreed. It took 11 days, which was close enough. The lean-to extension became, in the first year, a room for 2 women at a time. In the second year, they added a second extension with money partly from the ranch accounts and partly from an unexpected donation that came from Margaret Aldridge, who sent a bank draft in November with a short letter that said only, "For whatever it's being used for." HA's money should do something useful for a change. In the third year, a local widow named Hattie Marsh, the former sheriff's estranged wife, which was its own complicated irony, began coming out 3 days a week to help with the women, because Evelyn was running the household and the accounts and the teaching, and she was 38 years old and she had limits. "You cannot do everything," Hattie told her, with the frankness of a woman who had spent 20 years married to a man who believed she was a piece of furniture and had emerged from it with no patience for indirectness. "I know," Evelyn said. "Then stop trying." "I'm not trying to do everything," Evelyn said. "I'm trying to do everything important." Hattie looked at her over her coffee cup. "That's the same thing." It was not a comfortable observation, and it was accurate, and Evelyn spent 3 days being quietly irritated by it before she accepted that Hattie was right and reorganized how she was distributing her time. She was not good at this. She had spent 31 years believing that her value was located primarily in her usefulness, and the habit of working herself past the sensible stopping point was too old and too deep to be undone in a season. But she was better at it than she had been, and she recognized that improvement of a small, stubborn kind was generally how the things that mattered actually changed. Rose, at 17, was the first of the children to become genuinely involved in what they had started calling, without anyone formally deciding to call it this, the house. She began sitting in on the conversations with new arrivals. Not intervening, not playing a role, just present in the quiet, serious way she had always inhabited rooms. She had her father's patience and her mother's ability to read what was underneath what someone was saying, and she was, Evelyn slowly understood, better at certain kinds of conversation than either of them. She had grown up knowing what it was to need someone to simply stay without requiring anything back, and she offered this naturally, without construction. She's good at this, Cole said one evening, watching Rose through the window where she sat outside with a woman who had arrived 3 days ago and hadn't spoken much to anyone yet. She is, Evelyn agreed. Gets it from somewhere. Evelyn said nothing to that. She was watching Rose with the complex feeling that comes from seeing your child do something you cannot teach, something that lives underneath skill, in the architecture of who a person is. She did not know exactly who Rose would become. She knew that whoever it was, the world was going to get something from her that it needed. Clara at 17 was different from her sister in all the ways she had always been different. Where Rose moved through the world with steadiness, Clara moved through it with intensity. She had become a genuinely talented artist, filling sketchbooks at a pace that required regular resupply from the Denver catalog, and she had begun teaching drawing to the women at the house with an impatient, demanding pedagogy that somehow worked because the demand came from someone who believed they could do it. "You're too hard on them," Rose told her once. "I'm hard on them because they're better than they think," Clara said. "That's what Evelyn always says about you." Clara went quiet for a moment. "Well," she said finally, "it works, doesn't it?" James at 12 was the specific chaos that boys of 12 tend to be. Loud in ways that required frequent management, fascinated by things that regularly needed to be confiscated, and disarmingly sweet in the unexpected moments that made all the confiscations worthwhile. He had Will's mechanical aptitude. Will, who was now 28 and had stayed on and become the kind of person around whom a working ranch organizes itself. And he spent most of his free hours in the barn with Ernesto learning things that were not on any curriculum Evelyn had planned for him. "He's going to be a horseman," Cole told her one evening. "He's 12, she said. "Still, you can see it." She looked out the window at James, who was attempting something with a piece of harness that Ernesto was patiently redirecting. "He reads well," she said, which was perhaps not the most relevant response. "He does," Cole agreed, with the generosity of a man who understood what she was really saying. "Fine," she said. "He's going to be a horseman." Cole put his arm around her briefly, and they stood at the window watching their son fail and try again with the harness in the late afternoon light of a Colorado autumn, and neither of them said anything for a while, because there wasn't much to say about it that the watching didn't already say better. Harrison Aldridge died in the spring of the year James turned 13. It was not dramatic. A stroke, Margaret wrote in her letter, quick and apparently without great suffering, at his desk in a house he had spent the last decade occupying with diminishing relevance. Evelyn read the letter twice, looking for something she expected to find, satisfaction or relief, or the particular finality of a door closing, and found mostly nothing, or not nothing. Something more like the recognition that he had simply run out of road, the way all roads end eventually, and that the ending of his changed nothing about the damage he had done and nothing about the life she had built independent of him. She wrote back to Margaret with genuine condolences, because Margaret had spent 15 years trying to contain the harm her nephew caused and had done what she could with what she had, and that deserved acknowledgement regardless of the outcome. She did not mention what she actually felt, because it was too complicated to put in a letter, and Margaret hadn't asked. She did not tell the girls or James. It was not their story in any way that required them to carry it. She told Cole quietly that evening. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "Does it change anything?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "Not really." She paused. "It's just over, that part of it." He reached over and took her hand, the simple, direct way he had always had, and held it without turning it into a conversation, and after a while she felt the weight of it settle into its proper place. Not resolved, exactly, not erased, but properly filed. A thing that had happened to her, that she had survived, that was now sufficiently in the past to stay there. She squeezed his hand and they went inside for dinner. The dedication of Harper House happened on a Saturday in October, 15 years after Evelyn Harper had sat on a bench at Black Hollow Station with $6 and a cracked leather suitcase. The name had not been her idea. It had come, with characteristically direct logic, from Dorothy, the former schoolteacher, who had stayed on and become Evelyn's closest deputy, and who had said flatly at the planning meeting, "We're naming it after you, don't argue with me about it," and had proceeded with the paperwork before anyone could object. The building itself was modest, a proper structure now, not the extended lean-to of the early years, but a real building on a corner of the Bennett property, with 4 rooms for residents, a common room, a small library that had been assembled book by book over the years from donations and discards, and Evelyn's own childhood reader. It could house 6 women comfortably. It had been housing an average of 4 at any given time for the past 3 years. The women who had passed through it had gone on to Denver, to St. Louis, to towns all across the territory. Some had written letters. Some had not. Ruth Casper had visited twice, a settled woman now with a dressmaking business in St. Louis, and the particular quality of someone who has survived something and built a life on the other side of it. She and Evelyn had sat at the kitchen table and talked for 3 hours the first visit, and the second visit they had mostly just sat, which was better. The dedication day brought most of Black Hollow out, along with people from ranches and farms throughout the county, and Silas Grubb, who was 70 years old and had not slowed down noticeably, and Pete Grady's wife, who cried, and Hattie, who did not cry but looked like she was thinking about it, and Jane Aldridge, who came quietly and stood at the back and afterward found Evelyn and said only, "Thank you," and then left before anyone could make her the center of anything. Evelyn stood at the front of the assembled crowd and looked out at the faces of people she had known for 15 years, had borrowed from and helped and argued with and cooked for, and occasionally been very angry at. And she tried to find the right thing to say. She was not a natural public speaker. She never had been. She was better with one person than with 50, better with action than with declaration. But she had been asked, and she intended to answer. "I came to this town with nothing," she said. "I mean that literally. $6 in a bag I'd borrowed a strap from a broken harness to hold together." Somewhere in the crowd, Cole almost smiled. "I came here because I believe someone who turned out not to mean what he said. And I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. It wasn't courage that kept me in Black Hollow that first night. It was that I didn't have a return ticket." A small sound of laughter from the crowd. "What kept me after that was harder to explain. It was a man who offered me a spare room and didn't ask for anything except that I could cook. It was 2 little girls who needed someone to sit with them." She paused. "It was the fact that when I looked at this valley and these mountains and this particular collection of imperfect, complicated, generous people, I couldn't find a good reason to leave." She looked across the crowd at Cole, who was standing with James beside him, and Rose and Clara a little beyond. Her daughters, she thought, without qualification, hers in every way that mattered. And she thought about the bench at the station, and the cold, and the $6, and the letters she had carried in her coat pocket all the way from Columbus and laid flat under a stranger's mattress. "I don't think this place is named after me," she said. "I think it's named after every woman who sat on that bench and didn't know what came next. I just happened to be the one who stayed." She stopped, looked at the building behind her with its 4 rooms and its small library and its common room where women sat in the evenings, and gradually stopped holding their shoulders up around their ears. "I hope it's useful," she said simply. "That's all I ever wanted it to be." The crowd made a sound that was not applause exactly, more like the collective release of a held breath, warmer than applause, more personal. Grubb clapped, which started the actual clapping, and then it was a regular crowd again, making regular noise, and everyone moved toward the food that Pete's wife and Hattie had organized on the long tables outside. Clara materialized at her elbow. She was 22 years old now and carried herself with the self-possession of someone who knows what they're good at and has made a decision about it. She had a sketchbook under her arm, which she always had. She looked at her mother with the expression she used when she had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "You didn't mention any of the hard parts," Clara said. "No," Evelyn agreed. "The drought year, the Aldridge thing, I know. Why not?" Evelyn looked at her daughter. This particular human being who had once sat in a barn and told her that everyone left eventually, who had stood in a Market Street crowd and cried, "Please don't make her go away in front of 50 people without flinching," who had grown into someone whose interior life showed up in the shadows. She put in her drawings, careful and true. "Because the hard parts aren't the point," she said. "They happened. They were real. But they're not the point of the story." "What is the point?" Evelyn considered this. A real question deserved a real answer, not a tidy one. "That you end up where you're supposed to be sometimes because everything went wrong," she said. "Not in spite of it, because of it. Because if Harrison Aldridge had been a decent man and married me and given me what he advertised, I would never have sat on that bench. I would never have been anywhere near your father and you and your sister and James." She paused. The worst thing that ever happened to me was the beginning of the best thing. Clara was quiet for a moment. That's frustrating, she said, as a narrative principle. I know, Evelyn agreed. You can't plan for it. You really can't. Clara looked at the building, opened her sketchbook, looked at a page. I drew it this morning, she said, before everyone arrived. She held the book out. Evelyn looked. The drawing was detailed and careful in Clara's characteristic way. The building from a slight angle, the mountains behind it, and in the foreground a bench, small but unmistakable, empty. She stood there for a moment. The bench, she said. I kept thinking about it, Clara said. The bench at the station, where you were sitting when Papa found you. She paused. I think about what would have happened if he hadn't gone to the station that day, if he'd sent Ernesto for the supplies, or just hadn't been there. I'd have figured something out, Evelyn said. Maybe, Clara said. Or maybe not. She took the sketchbook back, looked at the drawing herself. I think about how close it was. 1 day, 1 hour. Papa almost didn't go to town that Saturday. He told me that once. He'd been planning to send Will. Evelyn had not known that. She stood with the information for a moment, feeling its weight. He changed his mind, she said finally. He changed his mind, Clara confirmed. How close everything had been. How many times the whole shape of their lives had turned on something that small. A changed plan, a letter answered or not answered, a man who paid attention on a train platform instead of looking away. She had spent 15 years building something solid and real, and it all traced back, if you followed it far enough, to a bench in a cold afternoon and a woman with $6 who hadn't cried because she'd decided crying wouldn't help. She had not been brave in any cinematic sense. She had been stubborn, which was different. She had been practical when falling apart would have been easier. She had said yes to a spare room in a stranger's house because it was what was available, and she had stayed because the need was real and she could meet it, and she had fought because running would have required a return ticket she didn't have. That was the truth of it. Not a story of exceptional courage, but of ordinary persistence pushed past the point where most people stopped. Cole found her 20 minutes later where she had wandered to the far edge of the gathering, looking out at the pastures that ran south from the house toward the foothills. He stood beside her in the comfortable silence of a person who had been standing beside her through 15 years of ordinary and difficult days and had no requirement of the silence beyond the standing. Clara showed me the drawing, he said. She's good. She is. He was quiet for a moment. You didn't tell me almost sent Will to town that day. She turned to look at him. Clara told me. He looked faintly embarrassed. I forgot I'd told her that. He looked out at the pastures. It's a strange thing to think about. Very strange. I changed my mind because I needed to check on the harness supplier myself. Not for any... I wasn't acting on instinct or anything like that. I needed to check on the harness. I know, she said. He stopped. You changed your mind, she said. That's all. You changed your mind and you went to town and you paid attention to something happening on a platform and you did something about it. She looked at him. You didn't have to do something about it. Didn't feel like a choice, he said. That's how the good choices usually feel. He was quiet for a moment. Then, are you all right? She looked at the mountains. She looked at the building behind them, where people were still gathering and eating and talking, and at the family she could find in the crowd without trying, Rose, who was deep in conversation with Dorothy, Clara, who had found a quiet spot and was drawing again, James, who had climbed something he shouldn't have and was being addressed about it by Will with the weary authority of a man 7 years older who has seen this particular behavior before. She thought about the life she had imagined on the train from Columbus, the respectable rancher, the solid house, the smooth promised surface of something better. That imagined life had no weather in it, no broken harness, no burnt soup, no drought year, no cracked basin in a spare room at the end of a stranger's hall. It was a drawing of a life, not the thing itself. The thing itself was this, every difficult and ordinary and irreplaceable inch of it. Yes, she said. I'm all right. She was more than all right. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, which was not a thing she had ever expected to be able to say, and she did not say it aloud because saying it aloud felt like tempting something. But she held it, quietly, privately, the way you hold the things you've worked hardest for. Cole put his hand in hers. They stood at the edge of the gathered crowd and looked out at the long grass moving in the wind off the mountains and the light going gold and long in the way of late October afternoons at altitude, and neither of them needed to say anything more about any of it. The river runs to the sea, Evelyn thought. She had told Clara years ago that it meant running toward something rather than away. She had been right about that. She had just not understood yet what the something was. Now she did.